Everyone, and welcome to the latest installment of the Compassion and Social Justice Lecture Series. For reasons of COVID, this is obviously a virtual experience. My name is Christopher DeBono, and I'm the Vice President of Mission, People, and Ethics at Providence Healthcare here in Vancouver, Canada. I will also be your moderator today for this lecture. So let us begin in a good way in truth and reconciliation. And let me share that it is my privilege and honor to be broadcasting this lecture series from the unceded territories of our three host nations, the Musqueam, the Squamish, and the Tsleil-Waututh. We are indeed very, very grateful to be guests on these lands. And it is in that same spirit of hospitality that I would like to welcome the over 280 people who are tuning in today from across the province, and we have a special welcome for our partners from the other health authorities, but also across the country and indeed internationally. We are so happy you have chosen to spend this time with us. A few words about this lecture series. It is really important to know that the four sponsoring organizations are very, very committed to compassion and social justice, hence the title of our series. Those four institutions are Providence Healthcare here in Vancouver, St. Paul's Foundation, St. Mark's College at the University of British Columbia, and our very, very important sponsoring relationship with the Archdiocese of Vancouver. A few housekeeping points before I move to introduce our speakers today and get on with the presentation. The first is that this lecture series, like all the other ones, is being recorded. So it will be available for you to share with others as you see fit. As we record, only those that are on the screen are recorded. So for all those who are viewing, you will be muted and you will be unrecorded. But we would like to encourage you, as being part of this conversation, to submit questions for the Q&A section that I will share with the two speakers. They will share for 15 minutes each, and after that we'll have a short fireside chat with them, and I will begin then to review the kinds of questions that you would like to help seed our joint conversation together. You can submit a question by tapping on the Q&A button that is on the right-hand side of your screen. And please, as you submit those questions, remember all of the regular standards for online submissions. The questions will be monitored, and what will happen is that as they are cleared, they will pop up on the screen, and you are able to upvote questions that you find very interesting as well. With that done for housekeeping, it is my great honor to welcome the Archbishop of Vancouver, Reverend Michael Miller, to give us a few words of welcome now.
It's my pleasure to welcome you to the next installment of the Compassion and Social Justice Lecture Series. With COVID-19 still upon us, this series has prudently moved to a virtual platform. As Archbishop of Vancouver, I fully support these lectures. I believe these critical conversations must go ahead, even though we can't meet in person. Simply put, by advancing compassion and social justice in healthcare and education, we advance the health and well-being of all British Columbians, especially the most vulnerable. I wish to thank Providence Healthcare, St. Mark's College at the University of British Columbia, and the St. Paul's Foundation for making these lectures possible. The Archdiocese of Vancouver is proud to be your sponsor, and to those joining in online, I say thank you. Enjoy, engage, and please continue to advocate for compassion and social justice in our healthcare system.
Thank you, Archbishop, for those words of welcome. So today's theme is compassion and imagination in leadership. In many ways, especially in these days, it goes without saying, perhaps, that leadership is always important. But we know that especially to be the case. We're in the midst of the second wave of COVID. We are desperately working to ensure that everyone that can receives the vaccination as quickly as possible. There is unrest internationally that we're all aware of. And coincidentally, this lecture series happens on the birthday of Martin Luther King, that social justice giant. Yes, leadership and exemplary leadership has never been more important than it is today. Today, both of our speakers will speak candidly and personally about being leaders in healthcare as well as education. They will share with us the combination of our title of how compassion and imagination fit into each of their leadership approaches. And I'm very excited to introduce them, and get on with hearing what they have to say. So let me start with our first speaker. Fiona Dalton is the CEO of Providence Healthcare. Originally from the UK, Fiona's leadership is exemplarily known for its emphasis on people and a collaboration and organizational culture committed to performance excellence and effective management. In particular, we invited Fiona today because she is passionate about leading people, passionate about leading organizations, and joined Providence Healthcare because she felt a very particular alignment with the values and mission that we share. The other reason we'd like Fiona to share with us is that she is amazingly creative in the way that she uses stories to inspire people to live and lead the mission here at Providence in serving people in care, research, and education. So handing over now the microphone to Fiona Dalton. Welcome.
Thanks so much, Christopher, for the really kind words, and it's a pleasure to be here. I think talking about leadership is challenging. It's challenging because it's nebulous, and that's the kind of intellectual challenge. But it's also, there's a real risk, I think, of arrogance. And I always remember the first time I was asked to do a talk on leadership, and I just told my mother I'd been asked to do it, and she was super anxious, and she said to me, "Be really careful, Fiona, not to boast." And so I thought, well, that's a good rule in life anyway, isn't it? But I think I have learned some humility in my life. I always remember the best advice I ever received as a young management trainee in my early 20s, my first hospital job, with all that kind of enthusiasm and confidence you have in your early 20s. And someone said to me, "Fiona, if someone disagrees with you, it might not be because they're stupid." And that's been kind of engraved in my brain from ever afterwards. So I just wanted to emphasize that I can't talk about leadership from a position of being an expert, because I'm absolutely not. We are absolutely all imperfect, and we're all trying to work out our best way of doing this. And so I thought actually I would just tell some stories. And Christopher mentioned my joy in telling stories, and this is really because I've always wanted to be a writer. That was my childhood ambition. And looking back to why did I want to be a writer, I wanted to be a writer because I could really feel the power of stories and how they change things and how they made people feel. And I wanted to be part of writing those stories. And I've never been able to do that professionally, but what I do get professionally to do is to tell stories, and I see the power of those stories being told. And I think particularly in challenging times, stories that appeal to the imagination as a way forward have often been used to tell greater truths and to inspire hope. And clearly, I think no one would argue that we're in challenging times at the minute. And whether we're thinking about the COVID pandemic, the opioid epidemic, the recent publication of In Plain Sight report, and the clarity of how much work we have to do to make reconciliation and cultural safety a reality, the combination of all these and many other challenges certainly makes for interesting and challenging times. And I think in these times, a key part of leadership is inspiring hope. But that hope needs to be based on reality. It's no good just saying it's all going to get better really soon. I think both Donald Trump and Boris Johnson have found that tactic really doesn't work very well. We only get to inspire hope based on reality and a belief in what humanity can achieve. And I think stories are a really useful and helpful tool for leaders in this task. And if we think through the stories that we knew as children and that we tell now, compassion and imagination are a key theme in many of them, and they're fundamental to leadership and healthcare, I believe. Because isn't healthcare ultimately about the compassion to support patients through what can be changed and what can't be changed, and the imagination to build upon the things that we can change? So going to compassion first, I think compassion is fundamentally empathy plus practicality. So the most famous story about compassion in the Christian tradition is, of course, the Good Samaritan. And it's often said that the story is only famous because he actually did something. If he'd walked past the injured person and felt deeply their pain, but continued on his journey feeling really guilty for the rest of the day, that we wouldn't be remembering him 2,000 years later. I was also reminded years ago of the importance of doing no harm, of course, a basic tenet of medicine. I was working in a hospital when a vascular surgeon accepted an emergency patient from another hospital who needed specialist treatment. But unfortunately, our hospital was already full. So this patient ended up ventilated in our recovery. It blocked access to emergency surgery for all our other patients. And the director of anesthesiology wrote a scathing letter to the surgeon saying that the Good Samaritan would not have been famous today if, in trying to help the injured man, he'd run across the road, causing a traffic accident that had killed several other people. So I think we need to continue to be practical and ensure that our actions are truly helpful. And I've seen so much of this through the last 9 months of COVID, and I have seen people who continually run towards the problem. So when we've had an outbreak declared on whichever clinical area, people are absolutely understandably anxious, scared, and there is a human reaction, I think, which I completely understand, to try and be as far away as you can from that outbreak. But I've seen across the organisation people do the opposite and step up and say, can I come? I'd like to volunteer to work in that unit. I'm called to do that. I think I can help. And that's really, really powerful. So I think compassion is really important, but equally fundamental is imagination. And I would like to divide that into 2 bits. First of all, the imagination to walk in someone else's shoes. And I received a personal lesson in this last year from the relative of one of our long-term care residents. His name's Jason. He was the son of Elder Carol, who was a resident at Holy Family Long-Term Care Home. And I knew her in a small way personally. She would always talk to me when I went to visit Holy Family. And she was a survivor of the Alert Bay residential school, and had very, very powerful and influential person in the Indigenous and indeed the Christian community in Vancouver. On the National Indigenous Persons Day, she recorded a message of hope for the future of reconciliation in Canada, and this message was broadcast across the whole of Holy Family. But tragically, later that very same day, she died of COVID, and she was the first resident of Holy Family Hospital to die in this outbreak. As an organisation, we didn't handle the communication of her death and the return of her possessions well. And initially, we thought we couldn't find some of her jewellery. Happily, we did then locate almost all of it, but our staff were overwhelmed and scared by the first COVID outbreak that we were experiencing, which is all entirely understandable, but of course didn't make that any better for Jason. So he complained, and because of this, I personally went to his SRO to meet with him. And Christopher and I sat outside the SRO and talked to him, and he told us about his mother, about his life growing up in Kingham Inlet, and that's a place I've been, and I know the stunning wilderness of that location, and how he moved in his life between there and Vancouver, and he still has his community there. So I could personally apologise to him for his poor experience, and that was, I think, helpful. But he was also able to recognise the extreme stress of the outbreak situation, and to his absolute credit, he had the imagination to walk in someone else's shoes and talk to me about how he'd recognised how scared and frightened the nursing staff looked. What's really powerful to me, I was so sad to hear of his history and experience of racism throughout his life. And the comment that sticks with me to this day is, he said to me, when the nurses called to say to me that they'd found my mother's jewellery, I thought they were just joking with me because I was Indigenous. So that gave me the challenge of how do I have the imagination to walk in someone else's shoes, to appreciate the privilege that I have, that I've never had to assume that someone was joking with me because I'm white. And on a broader scale, how do we use our imagination to make space for another person or culture or population, and then use this as a determination to change our healthcare system and our society so that they're compassionate for everyone. I think imagination, though, is also really important in terms of how we imagine new solutions and new ways of addressing challenges. And I've got a couple of examples on this. One told to me by Dr. Julio Montana in terms of the AIDS, HIV epidemic across the world. And he talked to me about how people were raising money to build and support orphanages in Africa to look after all the orphans who had tragically been created through the deaths of their parents through AIDS. And he said to me, of course, that's important, Fiona, but actually what we need to do is make sure that there are less orphans in the future. So how do we use our imagination to also go to the root of the problem as well as just responding to it? And the other more recent example I've got is that through the digital supercluster, we've been developing the use of point-of-care ultrasound devices throughout BC, and particularly in rural and remote places. So people often see ultrasounds being used in terms of obstetrics, but also often in the emergency department, and they really are a way in which you can see inside the body in a really amazing way. And it can be handheld, it's portable, can be in the most remote places. But of course, it relies on someone being able to interpret what they can see. And so we're trying to create a network which uses artificial intelligence and backup and learning to help these devices being used effectively in the most remote areas. So we're really at the first stage of this, but we've also already got some really powerful feedback. And the story that I heard was from Campbell River, up in the north of Vancouver Island, where there's a street doctor who is a family doctor who works out of a mobile clinic doing outreach primary care for people who don't have access to, or haven't chosen to access more kind of standard primary care. And this doctor emailed us to say, I was the street dog in Campbell River this week, and I saw a woman who had not yet presented for any care, and she was pregnant. I was able to see her at the request of the mental health team. Because I could do an ultrasound, I could get a sense of where we were at gestational age. Seeing her baby's heartbeat and movements helped her to agree to engage in care, and I got her to the lab for her bloods minutes after leaving my care. And I think there is a real chance that that bit of technology, combined with compassion and imagination, has made a difference, not just for that woman, but for her baby's life, and potentially for her baby's life, and for future generations. So I thought it was a really nice example of how we can use technology and innovation in a compassionate way to truly make a difference. And in the last minute that I have, I wanted to talk a bit more about more hope for the future. And I wanted to ask everyone to think about how we can all lead with compassion and imagination through the current pandemic to a new world. And the words that have inspired me to do that are these beautiful words, I think, by Arundhati Roy. And she wrote, "Coronavirus has made the mighty kneel and brought the world to a halt like nothing else could. But this offers us a chance to rethink the doomsday machine we've built for ourselves. Nothing actually could be worse than a return to normality. Historically, pandemics have forced humans to break with the past and imagine their world anew. This one is no different. It is a portal, a gateway between one world and the next. We can choose to walk through it, dragging the carcasses of our prejudice and hatred, our avarice, our data banks and dead ideas, our dead rivers and smoky skies behind us. Or we can walk through lightly, with little luggage, ready to imagine another world and ready to fight for it." So I invite everyone listening to summon their compassion and their imagination, and together let's lead the way through this portal into a new world, one that is worth fighting for. Thank you.
Thank you, Fiona, for sharing your experiences and bringing us to the reality of what we see and what is imaginable. I'm reminded, as you were talking about technology with that case up in Campbell River, that 126 years ago when Providence began, we could never have imagined that kind of technology to open up lives and caring, and the sisters would recognize themselves in that story. I'm going to come back in a moment to some of your points about reality and suffering, but let's turn over now and let me introduce Dr. Michael Higgins, our next speaker, and we'll be bringing everybody back in a moment for joint conversations. But first, let me tell you a little bit about Michael before he shares. Michael is currently the interim president and vice chancellor of St. Mark's College at the University of British Columbia. He's a biographer, an author, a columnist, a religious scholar. He also contributes regularly to the Globe and Mail and other international publications. He's also on the CBC and CTV News as a commentator. Like Fiona, we wanted to invite Michael for many reasons, and I'd like to just share two of them. First of all, Michael is someone that I know very well. He's a public intellectual that is committed to the role of education for the betterment of society. And I think that's a really, really important thing to be thinking about these days. Second, he is very, very passionate about the ability of education to form the next generation of leaders. And in particular, to understand how the Catholic tradition offers, among other traditions, offers very important messages for shaping the common good. So you will see in a minute, Michael is very, very passionate about these things and passionate about the role of the imagination, especially at times of vulnerability. And over to you, Michael, and thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Christopher. Imagination, compassion, and leadership, the trinity of terms. And already Fiona has very nicely alighted on them both individually and how they connect. And I want to build on that momentum and provide a somewhat similar, but in some ways dissimilar reflection. The tender is the holy. The tender is the holy. Now, this is an interesting mantra, and it's a good mantra for inspiring leadership. A leadership that is marked by attention, by care to the individuals who make up the life of an institution, whether it's a hospital or an orphanage, a social service agency, tertiary, secondary, or a primary education system. This is life as it should be, rather than life as an abstraction. When life is an abstraction, we are all made subservient to a fleshless mission statement, instruments of utility rather than sacred vessels of human value. Just think of this in terms of a refrain I'll come back to. A model leadership consists of an imaginative reconfigurement with a spiritual attunement. The photographer, essayist, novelist, and cancer survivor, and one of the more impressive public intellectuals in the United States of the late 20th century, Susan Sontag, once said, "Compassion is an unstable emotion because it needs to be translated into action or it withers." End of quote. Now, compassion withers if it's not enfleshed. Compassion, again, is simply an abstraction, a term, a concept, a bit of nomenclature. Compassion has to be enacted. It has to be lived. It has to be found in the ways in which we attend to others, or it withers. It's a meaningless term. An American writer by the name of Francisco Ante, in his memoir, The Line Becomes a River, is a chronicle of his life with the Border Patrol and his transformative epiphany when he speaks of the need to break out of detachment and into compassion through imagination. Now here, let me just set the context here. This is a young guy, Hispanic, lives in New Mexico and Texas, finds himself, because he needs a job and because after his education, he's basically unemployed, he becomes a member of the Border Patrol. Well, the Border Patrol is a rather infamous organization in some regards, particularly under the now soon to end presidential administration in the US. And as a consequence, he begins to experience something in terms of an epiphany, an awareness that the people he's patrolling are his people. And the way that he can enter into their life and into their compassion, into their being, if you will, is by an imaginative compassion. He writes, standing at an altar assembled from remnants of wooden refugee boats, Pope Francis looked over the port of Lampedusa and asked his audience, has any one of us grieved for the death of these brothers and sisters? Has any one of us wept? Now here he is, and by the way, he ended up leaving the patrol, went on to graduate school, has become a quite distinguished writer, fairly frequent contributor to a number of important publications in the United States, including the New York Review of Books. But the example he used of Pope Francis and Francis's first papal visit, which was to Lampedusa, where he would welcome those fleeing from North Africa and from the political disruption in North Africa, is a wonderful illustration of the fact that here is life compassionately lived, not exhorted. People exhort all the time. They pontificate all the time. You should be doing this, you should be doing that. They profess compassion. But to live compassion is to be there, to be present, to attend. And that's what the young writer, Francisco Anti, discovered with the Pope. When Cantu saw the Pope doing what he did in Lampedusa, he saw a validation of his own need to enter into the lives of those he was patrolling and discover something very different than victims or criminals or refugees, but human beings. Part of this, and I use the example of Pope Francis because I want to talk just a little bit about what the Jesuits, or those in the Ignatian spiritual tradition, which is the tradition of the Jesuits, talk about it as the compositio loci, by which they mean, and Ignatius uses this in the spiritual exercises, that we envision something, we imagine something, because we grow spiritually and we grow in terms of our leadership because we can imagine alternatives, because we can reconfigure, because we can insert ourselves in some important way in a cameo role, if you like, in the life of the other. The imagination creates compassion. And poverty of imagination is the death of compassion. When you cannot insert yourself into the life, into the situation of another, how can you possibly be sympathetic? How can you be empathetic when you cannot even conceptualize, when you cannot in some important way enter into their lives? To imagine oneself then into the other, to enter into the mystery of the other, is to repudiate the tyranny of the statistic, the privileging of the quantifiable, the idolatry of the mathematical. Now we live on a daily basis with constant numbers, a veritable tsunami of statistics that tells us how many people have been infected by COVID, how many are in ICU units, how many have died and whatnot, and on a daily basis, okay? Each province, each city, the country itself, and then of course countries around the world. We're overwhelmed by the figures, but the figures don't capture the image. They don't visualize. It's not in the nature of a figure to visualize. It's in the nature of the imagination to do so. And so therefore, in our reportage, in our documentaries, in our media commentary, the most effective is not found with the charts and the graphs and the numbers and the prognostications of grief and foreboding, but in those special moments when we actually see a frontline worker, a professional worker, a social worker, a physician, an internist, someone engaging in that special moment of human encounter. That's what touches us. That's what moves us. It's not to deny that we don't need the other information. Of course, we always need data in order to make important judgments. We always need the empirical material that helps us make the right scientific judgment. But in and of itself, it is insufficient to be able to meet that pastoral and immediate human need of connection. That's what we mean by communion. That's why it's more than connectivity. It's a way of coming together as humans in the family. The imagination allows us to break through to the personal, to treasure the singular. And we do this by means of what Donald Nicol once time called the scientia cordis. I'm not a classical Latinist, so I tend to use the ecclesiastical version, scientia cordis, but in the end, it means the same thing. It's the science of the heart. And the science of the heart, what is the methodology of the science of the heart? I mean, lawyers have their methodology, scientists have theirs, social and physical scientists. The humanities have their various critical theories. What do you do when you talk about spirituality? What do you do when you talk about the heart? Well, it is the narrative. It's the storytelling that Fiona was talking about earlier. That's the modality. That's the means of connection, is through the narrative. So let me give you two brief examples. Well, I've been a president of a couple of Canadian universities, and for a period of time, I'm a vice president of a large American Catholic university on the northeast coast. And I remember specifically a chaplain that we had, originally a priest of the Diocese of Sacramento. And what he would do by way of his attending to the individual crises of students, this is pre-pandemic, whether it was suicidal ideation, whether it was a love crisis, whether it was failure, whatnot, and no matter what hour of the day, he came out for them. A fairly large campus of some 10,000 students, but he was there for them. They had a nickname for him, called him Father FJ. His name was Jerry Ryle, but they called him FJ. He was there for them at any time. He made himself present. He was transformative in their lives. Whether it was a moment of crisis, whether it was a challenge that was going to sunder their ambitions, whether it was a collapse in a relationship that was having a traumatizing effect on their emotional life, it didn't matter. He didn't prioritize it. He was just there for them because he understood that presence is curative. Presence is solace. Presence is a way of providing a conduit of the sacred and to the sacred. And here is another story that I have for you, an illustration of the power, if you like, of compassion as the model for effective leadership, as we are talking about compassion, imagination, and leadership. In a time that worships efficient management over pastoral presence. Now, we need efficient management. I'm a manager. Fiona's a manager. Christopher's a manager. We all manage in important ways, and management is key. But there's a difference between management, which we must use and deploy, and leadership, in which we model, in which we become exemplars, in which we become witnesses. And I was struck by one particular example. And it isn't an example of leadership at the institutional level. It's an example of leadership at the personal level. Recently, I saw on CBC and CTV an interview with Remy Bélanger de Beaufort. Now, he's a professional cellist who had been viciously maimed by a man wielding a sword in Old Quebec City on Halloween. Some of you may remember this. Disfigured, one of his hands mangled, several broken bones, severed muscles, and significant blood loss. He survived his ordeal. On TV, he struggled to lift his cello, enwrapped by bandages and splints and other medical instruments. And he managed to even hold his bow, in spite of having one of his fingers miraculously reattached. But it wasn't these impressive feats of adaptation that most struck me. It was his spiritual demeanor, his deeply humanist sensibility that touched me. He publicly forgave his attacker, and he prayed that a process of transformative justice would be accorded his assailant so that he could get the kind of mental health treatment he desperately needs. In other words, Christ-like, he moved beyond a facile forgiveness to a place of deep compassion and non-judgment. This is astonishing stuff. Now, was this a staged cameo? We're a cynical generation watching TV, right? Was it a contrived media moment, or was it a real disclosure of honest feeling and conviction? I am convinced, and I'm fairly seasoned about this, I've been in the media for over 40 years, that it was the latter. It was a reminder of what happens when the heart is free, when it is open, and when it is generous. He became, for me at least, a model for a kind of leadership that I should be exercising. And that's what we look for. We look for people who can be an exemplar, a way of living compassion, a way of opening themselves for the others, a way of achieving imaginative reconfigurement and spiritual attunement. The recognition that through imagination, through compassion, and through effective, meaningful, and visible leadership, we can live that mantra that the tender is indeed holy. Thank you.
Thank you, Michael, for that sharing, and especially for this connection between the tender being the holy in the absolute concrete realities that you shared with us. That's very helpful. I'm going to take a moment now with all of us, and I'm going to invite Fiona to the screen as well, to share in this fireside style chat before we open up to questions that are readily coming in, and I'm very grateful for that. Just an opportunity to bring the three of us into dialogue. And I want to pick up, Michael, on that idea of the tender being holy in terms of real experience, and also Fiona's sharing of stories of those kinds of sufferings that have drawn us in. And both of you have used the words of empathy and compassion to have access to another's experience, to walk in their shoes, perhaps, to make that encounter real. So I am curious about pushing this idea of suffering and leadership a little bit more deeply. And Fiona, if I might ask with you, can I ask you to think first, and then Michael, I'll ask you the very same question. Tell us a little more about the link between leadership that meets suffering, or leadership that emerges out of suffering, and certainly leadership that assuages suffering.
Yeah, thanks for the really interesting question. I think that this is at the heart of the linkage in my mind between clinical service and research. And I think it's why so much great research comes out of clinically based organizations, research active hospitals, because that research and that imagination is driven by the suffering. When we are seeing on a day-to-day basis all the people who we can't help, the diseases we can't treat, I think it absolutely drives the determination and the imagination to say, right, how can we do something differently? In terms of on a more kind of personal basis, I think that, we're all human, we have all suffered personally. We've not had the same experience and the same suffering as everyone that we work with. And so imagination is about translating your own suffering into someone and the imagination of their suffering, and not having had to precisely experience each of those before. And then the only other thing I would add is that I do think that we often think about healthcare as being the heroic intervention that saves a life, and of course that's amazing, but there is a lot of healthcare where we can't do that, unfortunately. And so healthcare is more about accompanying someone on their journey, and that's about being able to live with their suffering and be part of it. And that's a underestimated but very, very difficult and important thing to do as well. So it's my kind of top thoughts.
Thanks, Fiona. Michael, do you want to jump in? What are you thinking about as you think about that question, and hear Fiona as well?
Well, I was thinking, Christopher, of a time when a colleague and I, Douglas Edson, were commissioned by Macmillan to write a book called The Jesuit Mystique. And at one point, the research actually took us to Central America and the Caribbean, and to an experience or an encounter with suffering that certainly changed the way I look at things. Let me be specific. We were in San Salvador, and there was a remarkable American nun who was there, who on a daily basis had to live with the possibility that she could be assassinated. It was not uncommon for her in the morning to get up when she would go to work, and there would be a decapitated head at the foot of her garden, as a reminder of how seriously they took those who were committed to liberation theology or social justice. This was just a few years after the murder of the Jesuits at the University of Central America. And I was enormously touched by the fact that she could remain surrounded by such suffering, attentive to the suffering, but never losing the focus and the hope that sustained her during the day, whether she was involved in some kind of medical exercise or whether it was a more explicitly religious one. Shortly after that, I ended up in the slums of West Kingston, Jamaica, amongst the worst slums anywhere in the Western Hemisphere. And there was a community of Canadian Jesuits attached to St. Peter Claver Parish, a community. And one priest in particular, since deceased, fairly young, who took us around the slums in order to give us an experience of what they were undergoing on a daily basis, the crisis of survival, the violence, the gunshots, the enormous heat, the insufficient sustenance that came from the government. And it was, to me, an absolutely stunning example of lived compassion. Because when we went out, and he never wore a Roman collar, he just was known as the priest of the barrio, if you like, although there were others around him. And they would come to him, and they would touch him. They would put their head in shoulders or whatever, just to be able to be cuddled, to be protected, to know that somebody cared for them. And his presence, real and authentic, again, so utterly attentive to the suffering of these people, of their pain, but never in a way that diminished them in his eyes, and never in a way that frustrated him in his efforts to work significantly for the improvement of their condition. It reminded me of a comment that had been made by a Jesuit from Fordham, who said that you have to actually have the poor break your heart before you will ever experience compassion. And that had never happened until I had actually gone to El Salvador and to Jamaica. Finally, the poor broke my heart. Now, they should have before, because there are poor in Toronto, and there are poor in all the areas that I've lived in Canada. But it took that experience for the poor to break my heart. And that's the way, the opening, the portal to compassion.
Thanks, Michael, for that. And thanks, Fiona. I'm touched by this idea of our encounter with suffering. And Michael, you're calling out as well the ability to transform us, to break our hearts, perhaps to make us more available as well to the suffering of others. Some of the questions that are emerging, and one of the ones that I've been really thinking about, as both of you have shared, is that it's possible for those of us that are watching today as leaders to sometimes feel somewhat overburdened by that. So perhaps the mechanism is that I let brokenness into my life, that I witness with others, and that transforms me. But I would imagine, and I can speak for myself, that sometimes there's a sense in which the urgency of everything that needs to be done can kind of become its own tyranny and get in the way of that transformation that you're both speaking about, that availability. And I'm wondering if that's true, and I'd be curious if that's been your experience, that there can sometimes be a temptation to just hunker down and get everything done, that there almost isn't the space for the imagination. So I wonder, how do we feed the imagination when we're feeling overwhelmed by the to-dos and the checklists, and perhaps even all of the pain and suffering around us? Fiona, would you like to start on that, or Michael?
Oh, I'll let Fiona go first.
Sure. I think it's a real challenge, and there is, as leaders, we do have to balance that and do both. And there are times when actually we just need to get 20 things done today, and we don't need to be imaginative, but these things need to get done. But I think that we miss our role as leaders if we're just doing that every day. We absolutely have to create that space for that imagination, the thinking outside the box, the ability to try to think, how do we bring hope and inspiration to other people? I think that to do that, we need to be a bit compassionate to ourselves too, because we need to somehow give ourselves the space to forgive ourselves for not having done everything on the to-do list, and to go out and experience whatever it is in terms of the natural world or in terms of culture, books, music, and other stuff that's going on, because we have to get a perception from a different place in order to come back into our place with a new vision. And that's really hard to justify when there's 10 crises happening all the time. And I guess the only other thing practically is that is about having a team and working together, so that you've got someone who's on the list of crises every day and someone else who's got a bit more space to think, and then trying to make sure that you've got a bit of a rotation on that, so that each person gets the chance to do both.
Thanks, Fiona, for that. Michael?
Yes, I think that speaks directly to principles of imaginative governance or leadership. You know, notions of solidarity, notions of subsidiarity, collegiality, again, they're not just abstractions. They have to be implemented as principles of actual governance. Because if you don't do that, then everything just moves up to the leader, to the CEO, to the prime spokesperson of the institution. And as a consequence, your energies get depleted. Your thinking becomes exhausted. You become an emergency machine that responds to particular crises. And in the end, you face a terrible kind of intellectual and spiritual impotence, because you're not capable of actually, no one is capable of handling all of these things with the readiness and the discernment that you need in order to do them in measured ways. So you really do depend upon community. Effective leadership is shared leadership. Sure, the buck stops with the one at the top, but the one at the top it has to be able to work with everyone else to enable them to all, and you can't enable them if you don't attend to them. If you're not attentive to the crises or the challenges facing exhausted deans or administrators of particular programs in a university setting, and I can only talk about a university setting, and in a university setting doesn't have quite the urgency of crisis that you would have in a hospital, that Fiona would be dealing with different things in terms of a hospital administration than you would find in the university. The universities tend to be slightly more staid and predictable, and they have all kinds of crises, of course, but they're not quite of the same order. But it is important to have your own priorities as a leader in place. It's not just simply a matter of looking at downtime, feeding the imagination through fiction, listening to your favorite symphony or aria, or going to an art gallery. It's not just simply a dependence on the fine arts to replenish your soul. It's the fact that it's giving life to your imagination. It's re-energizing your intellectual capacity, not just your spiritual one. So it's not that the downtime is somehow, a decorative optional. It's constitutive of effective leadership. If the leader isn't replenished, if the leader doesn't have the imaginative resourcing, if you like, that comes from reading and meditation and listening, then that leadership is going to be handicapped. And so the ideal model is not a hierarchical, rigid model of coming down, but an effective model of delegation and sharing, because that way you ensure that the leadership itself and its team have been not only properly replenished, but are in a healthy and good space.
Thanks, Michael, and thanks both of you for speaking about the relationality, I think, of what leadership is and how it's best done together. I know both of you, and I know the passion with which you bring to your work. Michael, I'm just going to riff a little bit on the idea of urgency and non-urgency, but one of the reasons for these kinds of lectures and these kinds of conversations is indeed to bring the urgency that we have in healthcare to helping people who are suffering in care, research, and education, and bring that same intellectual academic passion all the time, asking what the next question is. So it is true. It's a little more urgent in terms of real people in front of us that are presenting with cardiac issues, for example. But I really appreciate the cross-pollination we're able to do. Before I go to another question that's just emerged from the Q&A, I'm going to share something that I think might be shared across our viewing audience, which is that in many ways, the joy in speaking with you is that you both appear to be very natural leaders. And I can imagine that, that the rest of us, as we're struggling through, might say, does Michael struggle in his leadership? Does Fiona struggle in hers? And what have you learned along the way of and you've already spoken in part to this, your own humanity in being a leader?
Fiona?
Well, I'm going to start with you this time.
Oh, all right. All right. Okay. Let me give you one example that I think is a good illustration, at least for me, about how I learn, because leaders are have to realize, or at least I'd have discovered, you have to be constantly open to learning and constantly open to correction. And if you're not, you're going to be courting disaster somewhere along the line. Before I've been in university for university leadership and as a professor, dean, whatever, president for 40 years. So I've been in, this is my life, right? But I started off in education as a secondary school teacher at St. Michael's College School in Toronto, which you would know. And I had an occasionally strained relationship with the principal of the school, who was quite theologically conservative, and I wasn't really. But I came to have enormous admiration for his leadership when I saw how he dealt with death. And it affected how, in many years later, I would go back to the scene in order to be able to emulate what I thought was his pastoral presence. Let me be precise. It was the end of the year, must have been about 1979, I guess, or something. And the class, graduation class, grade 13, was ready. We're going to have mass for them, and they were going to get their diplomas. And two of the brightest young students we had, and it was a bright school, it was a college prep school, had gone north for a little bit of a vacation, and they were canoeing, and they fell out of the canoe, and the water was so cold they suffered from hypothermia, died immediately. Well, we had to deal with that, and so they brought the bodies back, and they brought the bodies into the church. And I had arrived slightly late, and so I was at the back of the church when I came in, Holy Rosary in Toronto. And I saw this principal of the school, with whom I had occasionally strained relations. I saw how he handled their grief and their suffering, the parents and the students. He attended to them. He accompanied them with their silence. He knew when not to speak. He knew when to hold them. He knew how to respond to them in a respectful way that entered into their suffering. I never forgot that. It came back as an illustration or as an example of how I could cope with something when many years later, when I was president of a university in New Brunswick, one of our professors was murdered. He was an extraordinary man. He was a penologist, he was a sociologist, but he also volunteered at a penitentiary. And so he dealt with lifers, and he lived in circles of violence. He was a Catholic, but he was also a Quaker. But he didn't die as a consequence of his work in the penitentiary. He died as a consequence of protecting his young daughter from her husband. He was murdered. It was a terrible scene, and the young man eventually killed himself as well. I had to attend to this. I had to deal with the national media. I had to deal with Maclean's magazine, the CBC, everything, a professor murdered, and with the consequences of this for the community. I drew upon the example so many years earlier of this priest principal of a school who attended to the grief of not just the immediate family, but all those in attendance. That became my template for dealing with this provincial and indeed national moment of sadness. And so that's how you learn. You learn from mentors. You learn from other leaders who do something, and that what happens gets imprinted on you. And then at some point or other, it surfaces, and it becomes a model for how you're going to respond to a situation which is in your life virtually unprecedented. That's one example.
Yeah, thanks, Michael, for that. You're reminding me that, and I know this in my own life as well, that one of my models for how to respond to anything was based on watching somebody named Roger Schultz, one of the founders of the Taizé community, encounter people. And for those familiar, that he was on the cutting edge of ecumenism. And he would, when I met him, he was a very, very elderly man. But what struck me about his encounter is he would wait patiently as someone approached him, perhaps put his hand on his shoulder, and he would never speak first. And it was a very interesting model in terms of listening and engaging people where they need to start. So you gave me a flashback on that, but I just want to thank you for sharing the humility of learning from someone with whom you may have had a little bit of rubs in the past as you were cutting your teeth as a leader. Fiona, where does this question make you go in terms of your own experience?
I think you were saying that people might think, oh, it's someone else much more kind of a natural and confident leader than me. And I guess I feel like I can promise you that every single leader would be thinking that and would be thinking, yeah, I'm not good enough to do this. It's obvious that I've got all of these flaws. I say that, and then I think maybe some US presidents are not, in fact, in this category. But anyone else, I think, does have this feeling, and certainly I do all the time. One thing that I really struggled with is I am actually naturally very introverted, and the idea of talking publicly and having everyone kind of watching me and listening to me is something that is not something that's natural to me, and it's quite scary. And a coach helped me with that actually years ago by saying, Fiona, it's not about you, it's about the message. As a leader, you are there to give a message. And if the message isn't important, then don't do it. Absolutely don't speak. But if the message is important, then get it right. And you are the vessel through which that message comes. But don't be so self-obsessed to think it's about you at all. And that really helped, I guess, for me, overcome some of my kind of natural, maybe social shyness, awkwardness. But yeah, I would plead, I don't think anyone should think that anyone else finds this easy.
Thanks for that. In a way, what I was hoping to hear, and I've seen that, is just the humility that each of you brings to who you are and what you're trying to do. And I appreciate that other element of discernment as a leader about what needs to be communicated, and that choice to sometimes not go there if you don't need to say something. Let me pick up two questions that have come in, and we've got quite a few left. So hopefully we can get through most of them. I'm going to combine two. What we're talking about is reminding two of our listeners that, quote, compassion can be a painful experience, unquote. And there was a nod in terms of a piece heard from you, Michael, that it was inspiring to hear how your points about testimonies on suffering and solidarity make the presence of God very real. So I'm wondering, just to pull these questions together, what do we do with the painful experience of compassion? And how do these experiences speak to the presence of the holy in the service we offer? And I'll just let that question sit, and either of you can jump in.
Well, to build a little bit on what Fiona has said earlier, I think sometimes, to deal with the suffering that elicits the compassion and the suffering that attends upon the compassion, very often the language of compassion is the language of silence. It is what you had referred to earlier when you were talking about Roger Schultz. It's the simple presence or accompaniment that's so important. Our natural tendency, and unlike Fiona, I'm an extrovert, so the natural tendency is to talk all the time. And the talking all the time is not only therapeutic, it's a way of keeping at some distance from the crisis and the terrors of our lives. You exhaust them by talking so much. But the importance of being able to attend to the suffering through silence is a form of connection with that pain. All of human life is to some degree pain. We experience pain regularly. It's a sign of life, right? physical pain, emotional pain, psychological pain. We always experience pain. So as human beings, we understand that pain is a common denominator. So pain is a way in itself of connection. But connection, as I alluded to earlier, is not quite the same as communion. Connection is talking to others. Connection is a way of being present to others. But communion is deeper than that. It's actually entering into the other, of being with the other. And more often than not, that's the language of silence. And the examples that I have seen most potently have not been in a university setting, but they've been in either palliative care or hospice care, where just simply being present is itself the gift.
Thank you, Michael. Fiona, any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I haven't experienced the wanting to talk in the same way as Michael did in response to that, but I have experienced the wanting to do something, and I think we all know that kind of sense of, if only I could do something. And often there isn't anything that you can do, but what you can do is to be there, to truly be present. And I think that we underestimate that in leadership. For whatever the painful or the important situation is, the physical and emotional presence of truly being there is very, very powerful, I think. And so that's something I think we should prioritize.
Yeah, thanks. Thanks also for joking a little bit about each of our personalities and our ability to talk all the time or just to be quiet. But I really appreciate perhaps the most important lens, which is to bring to our personalities that discernment of what to do or how to respond or how to be quiet. I'm going to take another question. And Fiona, I might direct this one to you. When we talk about the imagination, this question asks, might we not also be thinking about what it means to dream together with others or with ourselves? And just kind of what your dream is for, in this case, to speak specifically to the spiritual component of healthcare, but to healthcare in general. So is dreaming a helpful way to think about what we're talking about, first of all? And if so, how does it shape the future of our services?
Yeah, no, it's a great question, I think. When we say dream, I think it's a metaphor for saying, how do we get ourselves outside of the existing constraints, and really think what are we striving for? What is the perfection in this? And the other word that was really important, I think, in that question is together, because I think you often, as a team, you think that we're all striving towards the same thing. But if you get each person to actually describe, so what is your dream? Often they are a bit different, and they're not contradictory, but everyone's describing a different aspect, and that comes from their own experience, and often their own suffering, actually, and then therefore their own wish to heal a certain thing. And so that ability to do things together, I think, is really powerful. I think that ultimately we're all wanting to be truly known by someone else. And the more that we can do that, both with colleagues and with patients and the people that we serve and the wider community, the more powerful we get to get the dream, both to make it the right dream, but also to work out how we achieve it.
Thanks, Fiona. Michael, does that connection of dreaming or togetherness speak to you in a way that you'd like to share about?
Dreaming always somehow suggests fantasizing or distraction or frivolity for me. It shouldn't. I prefer envisioning. It may be just a semantic difference, really. But one has to always think in terms of new things. And that's why I use that phrase, the imaginative reconfigurement with spiritual attunement, that you're constantly in the process of thinking afresh, of thinking new, because the pressure on leaders This is certainly true in the education or university sector, and I suspect is very much true in the hospital sector as well, is that we're expected to fix things, to be doing things, to weigh the quantifiables and the deliverables and all the other nomenclature that infects our discourse, and say, well, this is what this is what we weigh, this is what we are have achieved because we can weigh it, because we have the matrices that tell us these are the signatures of our success, right? But in an important way, good leadership is also humility, as was indicated earlier by Fiona and by yourself, Christopher, that you know what you can't fix. You know where you need to depend upon others to help you to articulate a new vision or a regenerated vision. You need others to be with you in order to achieve something that is actually beyond you, because we live in a culture where we measure a person's success or the value of their life in terms of their position in society, the prestigious role that they exercise, their salary, their compensation. And yet we know in our hearts that these aren't the fundamental criteria of human value. This is not to gainsay their importance, it's only to say that it's secondary, that the importance is to be found elsewhere. I love that line that Pope Francis used in that new book about dreaming in post-pandemic world, which is a remarkable book that came out just before Christmas, in which Pope Francis allows himself to think beyond the pandemic. And it's generated enormous interest in both Catholic and considerable non-Catholic circles about the Pope thinking, where are we going to go after the pandemic? And one of the ways he's thinking is to reconnect us with our humanity and with the attention to those on the periphery. He remembered a particular scene when he was an archbishop in Buenos Aires, and he talks about the cartoneros, and the cartoneros are the people, the ones who push the cartons. And there isn't a day in Vancouver that I'm coming to work that I don't see people pushing their cartons, pushing their shopping carriages that they've taken, carrying their life's possession in this. Well, the cartoneros, the people on the periphery, are the people that bring us into connection with our humanity. And you can see, and this is a great credit to the healthcare system, particularly to St. Paul's, you can see the work you do in your outreach to those suffering from opioid crisis of any form, or addiction, or homelessness. You're present in remarkable ways that speak to the vision of the institution and to its history. Well, that seems to me a collective effort. It's not just the leader doing this, not just the board working on a strategic plan. It's the people enacting it, because in the end, we always respond. That's how I opened my reflection earlier, not to an abstraction or to a problem, but to the enfleshed, the actual individual in Strathcona Park. That's what matters. And it seems to me that is where we bring compassion and empathy and imagination and leadership all together, beautifully fused in witness.
Thanks, both of you. This question of dreaming or envisaging is quite a generative conversation, and I appreciate the reality with which each of you is entering and thinking about what we can do. We have about 5 more minutes for conversation, and there's a question that does speak to this again, and if I can ask you to speak personally as you have been. The question is, how does your own spirituality feed the work that you do? And certainly both of our institutions are grounded in a commitment to spirituality and a commitment to that place in care, research, and education. So I'm just wondering personally, maybe there's one example of how your spirituality helps you get up in the morning to do the work that each of you does. Always love it when the question makes you pause.
That's right. I'm going to leave it to the introvert to handle this one.
I think it's fundamental, and I think we all spend too much time at work to not bring our whole selves to work, and that includes our spirituality and our souls and what we're passionate about. And I think healthcare is a real privilege, because it's so clear that we're doing something that's just so important, and that's not. that's not something that many people have the privilege of. I think for me, it was, and I've talked about it a lot, it was a big decision to come here from across the other side of the world. I left my friends, my family, my job. Didn't quite anticipate that I would not be able to fly back and see them, but anyway. But I did that because I felt called to be here, and I felt called to be here by the values of this organisation, and it's not something that I've ever regretted. And so I guess that's the most obvious example for me of how that's worked.
Thanks, Fiona.
I think spirituality is a complex area, of course, and I like to think of it in terms of discernment, but also in terms of prayer. But in the end, for those of us in leadership positions, it has a very practical dimension. It's very pastoral, right? I mean, again, it's back to the earlier observation that a spiritual life is a lived life as it is, rather than just simply an abstraction. And I'm conscious of this in concrete terms on a daily basis, and the ironies and ambiguities around, contradictions around all of this. I mean, I've written at least 4 books on a monk, but and monastic spirituality has great personal appeal to me. But I don't live like a monk, and I'm not a monk. I live in the real world. I have a family, I have children, I have a wife, I have friends, and I have a job. So the monastic rhythm may appeal to me imaginatively and has something that can offer, but then I have to translate that into what I do in the practical world. And it is in the practical world that one encounters the deeper recesses of the human heart and of the human soul. And that doesn't necessarily theological, right? I mean, our great mantra now is, I'm not religious, but I'm spiritual. Well, one can argue about the meaning of these categories and the fact that that's a false polarization. At the same time, however, it does speak to something that's fundamental to all of us, and that is that there's something inherent in our aching toward the transcendent. And in aching toward the transcendent, we're drawn deeper into our own human resources. And so that's kind of a heady way of saying that when I get up in the morning, I think like that. I don't. I think, how am I going to get to the university in half an hour? But it's the motivating, it's the substratum, right? In a way that your spirituality is your cantus firmus. It's your backbone. It's the thing that holds your life together. That's why it needs nurturing, like compassion. And the imagination has to be fed. That's why you have to read.
Thanks, both of you. I see that our time is quickly coming to an end. I do want to underscore what I so appreciate about this conversation and the gift that it has been, is this constant return to what really matters, both for ourselves and as you say, that nurturing, but also for the vulnerable that are in the world and whose suffering comes to our doorsteps, comes to our hospitals, comes to our institutions. And that is true locally, provincially, and nationally and internationally. So Fiona and Michael, first of all, just a very warm thank you, both of you, for sharing so openly, also for sharing with the sense of humor that I treasure in both of you, and the ability to laugh as well as cry when we need to. This has been a wonderful opportunity to think about compassion, imagination, and leadership. And I will look forward to future opportunities to have you both on the Compassion and Social Justice Lecture Series as we move forward. So a big thank you, first of all, to both of you.
Thank you, Christopher. Thanks, Fiona. Good to work with you again.
Yeah, thank you so much. It's been really great.
And I'd like to take a little bit of time with our viewers as we conclude to also call out the very important support that we get from the Archdiocese of Vancouver. The funding for this particular lecture series and some of our initiatives around healthcare ethics in partnership with St. Mark's and the Foundation was made available through the very gracious sponsoring of one of the Archbishop's dinners around the question of Catholic healthcare and ethics. So a very big thank you to the Foundation and to the Archdiocese, and thank you, Archbishop Miller, for your support. I would like to also thank you as you're watching today and joining us, and remind you that these videos will be available. They'll be emailed to each of you. You provided us with your email address. We are very passionate that the work we're doing be shared as appropriately as it can to assist every organization and every center trying to do the common good across this country and beyond. So feel very free to share those and also to share with us any ideas for the future. Our lecture series will continue in a few months in the springtime, and again, we will notify you about that. We are very, very excited with some of the lessons we've learned through COVID and the virtual abilities that we have. So with the reality that this has been a gifted time together, I will say good afternoon and good evening to you wherever you are in our country. I'll end by wishing you a very, very happy and perhaps better 2021. And I'll close with the words of our public health officer, Dr. Bonnie Henry here, who reminds us every day to be calm, to be kind, and to be safe. And with that, I say good afternoon and thank you for joining us on this installation of the Compassion and Social Justice Lectures. Goodbye.